Hey everybody, and welcome to another firsty on my Nostalgia Trip games. This time I've got a... Damn, this is heavy. An Atari 520 ST-FM, which I got for myself just before Christmas last year. And I have to say, it's a hoot. The difficult thing about the Atari STs is that there are so many different variations of it. And all versions of the STs have different operating system versions, which means that there are so many games out there that are incompatible with certain versions of TOS. So there's only so many games that I'm even able to do with the Atari ST-FM that I have, because most of the Nostalgia Trip games that I would have for the ST itself were made for the STE, which is an enhanced version of the ST, so I can't do much of those, but I'll do what I can with this one. And here are the first 5 games for the Atari ST. Enjoy.
Sometime in the late 80s, one of my friends had borrowed an Atari STE from one of his friends, which I got to experience for a couple of hours in a single day. From what I remember, the first game I ever saw and played on the said STE was Stunt Car Racer, and ST was the first platform I ever saw Stunt Car Racer on. But since my nostalgia for it is almost entirely related to the Commodore computers, particularly the Amiga, the game was already mentioned in the second Amiga episode of my Nostalgia Trip games. Aside from Stunt Car Racer though, I'm having a hard time remembering anything else I ever saw on the Atari STE back then. But I did read about many ST games that got me excited until emulation came along. For one, Oids was a game that used to be regularly praised in a Finnish computing and gaming magazine called Mikrobitti, which caught my attention for its praise, but it took me a while to recognize the surprisingly simple idea behind the reported genius. What Oids basically is a combination of Choplifter and Gravitar, or if you're not familiar with the original arcade classic, Gravitar can be replaced with Thrust from 1986 on the 8-bit computers. Other than in the travel sequences between levels and the title screen, Oids is not a game that boasts the 16-bit capabilities with its graphics and sounds, but rather gives you an example of perfection in gameplay. Controlling your V-shaped spaceship in the environment it travels to is a bit more floaty than in either Gravitar or Thrust, but enough to give you a sense of very different sort of gravity. The idea is to destroy buildings and save prisoners, much like in Choplifter, and the landing spots are clearly notable as leveled surfaces. After accomplishing your task, you return to your mothership and move on to the next planet. Simple as that. Oids is a solid Atari ST classic, and it's one of those games that was worth owning an ST for back in the day. Since 2014 though, Amiga owners have been able to play the game on their chosen platform as well, but you do need a more powerful machine than an Amiga 500 or 2000 to run the game properly. In my case, that means I'll stick with the ST version now that I'm able to. Recommended to me by my friend and Retro Game Talk Show hosting colleague Bob Engstrand, Nitro from Psygnosis is a nicely different sort of a racing game. Although it's a top-down racer with multi-directional scrolling, every stage is built so that you start at the bottom of the map and finish at the top. As had become pretty much the norm at this point in racing games, you can collect money, which you can use to enhance your car's performance. Also similarly to Super Off-Road and Super Sprint, 3 players can play Nitro simultaneously. Granted, it's not the most original of racers in that regard, but it does offer 32 tracks within 4 different areas to race on, as well as the occasional nighttime races in between daytime ones. Thematically, it's a post-apocalyptic racing game, so the selectable characters and cars reflect that in some ways, and the last area certainly gives you a more apocalyptic feel than the first 3. I've only played Nitro a couple of times now, but as it is one of the first games that I've played after getting my own Atari ST, I'm pretty sure I'll be coming back to it every now and then. Nitro was also released for the Amiga and DOS, so it's worth checking out there as well. Another Atari ST game that I used to wonder about in a gaming magazine about 30 years ago was Hydra from Domark. Although the review made the game seem a bit subpar water version of Road Blasters, it didn't stop me from wanting to play the game, which I eventually did through emulation. But was it worth the wait? Well, it's one of those double-edged sword kinds of things. It's a nice experience to finally try out something you've been thinking about for a long time, but at least in this case, it's not nearly as good as you hoped it to be. Rather, the review was pretty much spot on, which I think gave it something like 50 to 60% score. So it's not abysmal, but mediocre and largely forgettable if it weren't for the cool looking loading screen and the hero that looks vaguely like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Since having recorded the ST footage, I took the time to dig into the arcade original on MAME, and frankly it's not that much better. But then, there are worse Road Blasters variants, and if nothing else, there are some visual elements in Hydra which will always remain nostalgic for me, for no better reason than reading a magazine 30 years ago. Hydra was released for all the usual platforms at the time, but don't expect a comparison article anytime soon. Around the same time I read about Hydra, I also became to wonder about a fantastically titled Horror Zombies from the Crypt, because I had become a fan of horror movies from an early age. Being one of Millennium Interactive's first releases along with Cloud Kingdoms, Kid Gloves and James Pond Underwater Agent, Horror Zombies was certainly more aimed at gamers who didn't necessarily go for the most obvious hit games and got their kicks from more underground humor and ultra-violence, for there was certainly enough of gore in Horror Zombies to get it banned from Germany, although I'm not sure if those laws were effective at that point yet. So obviously it was one of the first games I played through emulation when the first proper 16-bit emulators came along, although for some reason I played it on an ST emulator first instead of Amiga, even though it was also released there. In fact, to this day, I've never played the Amiga version, though I did have a go at the DOS version some years ago. Well anyway, Horror Zombies from the Crypt is an action platformer with some slight puzzle elements, but the main attraction here is obviously the gory details. It's not a game I would particularly recommend to anyone, but I think it's better than what the review said at the time. Then again, I'm a sucker for a certain level of badness. Now let's end this with an Atari ST necessity. Dungeon Master, the other major hit game from FTL after Oids. If there's a game that pinpoints the true beginning of the 16-bit era, I would say it's Dungeon Master, even though there have been other dungeon crawlers prior to this. As it happens, Dungeon Master brought in real-time combat elements into the mix, as well as dynamic lighting and more immersive sound effects. As an RPG, Dungeon Master is basically the blueprint for all modern RPGs, on top of which everyone has added their own extra building blocks and modified some of the basics while at it. But unlike most modern RPGs, Dungeon Master has a tile-based movement which forces you to think very locally at first. But as the game progresses, you need to find out what kinds of things happen in the vast mazes as you go on doing random things. I have to admit, having played some later games of a similar style first, such as Eye of the Beholder and Elvira Mistress of the Dark, I wasn't all that impressed when I first saw Dungeon Master. In fact, my main gripe with Dungeon Master to this day is that all the levels of the dungeon look the same, and with secret walls and traps the game is very disorienting and it's insanely difficult to keep up with where you're going and what you're supposed to be doing at any given time. Some more professional gaming reviewers have also mentioned that the endgame in Dungeon Master can be frustrating to no end, but I can't really comment on that since I haven't really made progress further than the 4th or 5th level. In spite of all my hardships with Dungeon Master, I have to admit it's one of the most influential games of all time, and deserves to be given some proper time, which I would if I had the time necessary to give it. But for any of you Dungeon Master fans out there, I'm sure it's the perfect nostalgia trip game, and spend a couple of weeks with it at a time.